Well, hello and welcome tonight's Randomizer. It's 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm Charles Schultz with Schultz Laboratories and Universe Science Center, and tonight we're going to be discussing the topic of social statics. A lot of people are familiar with the term social dynamics. This is a little bit different, and you know, psychological fields often are considered not quite a science because it's not the same as something you can pick up and measure. But it does have elements of science as a discipline, and it generally ends up being about populations and not individuals. A lot of statistics are used to analyze social dynamics, but social statics. There is a book, a seminal book written by a fellow by the name of Herbert Spencer. It was published in 1851, called Social Statics, and he had a long subtitle to it, The Conditions Essential to Happiness Specified, and the first of them developed. Well, that in itself was interesting. So this is going to be an interesting chat. First of all, I want to encourage people to join us. Go to the Schultz Laboratories website, click on the links either at schultzlaboratories.com or universesciencecenter.com, and join us for our classes 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Meta World Lesson 3 will be later tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard. And also become a member of Schultz Labs and support our development and growth so we can add more galleries and dynamic interactive content. Get your Oculus Rift, go in and see our 3D world and see what's amazing and educational and fun, and help us make it grow. And thank you for being here tonight. So Herbert Spencer was an interesting fellow, referred to as a polymath, somebody with a lot of abilities and capabilities, and he was very interested in the conditions of human happiness and misery. And so when he wrote his book, he was very clear about what he laid out. Now, in the beginning, I thought this was going to be kind of an interesting topic, but not necessarily apropos. And I'm always trying to look for something that makes our world change in one way or another, or we can definitely say what it added to our society. In this case, I actually have to read a couple of quotes. When I started reading his material, I was rather astounded. It was very different from what I thought. Now, his concern was that in any society, you had to have conditions so that people would be satisfied with their lives or capable of carrying on with their lives, feeling they were making a contribution or doing what they should be doing. That slavery was inherently evil because it was an imposition on your will, your free will. Everybody pretty much believes that you can do anything you wish as long as you don't harm anybody else, and that's a very fundamental principle. We're free to choose anything we want. Of course, with the freedom of choice, we always recognize the burden of cost. For every choice that we make, there is a consequence. And so he gave a great deal of thought to these things, and some of the things that he brought up really stand clear. So just a quote from his book, again, published in 1851. He wrote, "As a corollary to the proposition that all institutions must be subordinated to the law of equal freedom, one cannot choose but admit the right of the citizen to adopt a condition of voluntary outlawry." I love that word. "If every man has freedom to do all that he wills, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man, then he is free to drop connection with the state, to relinquish its protection, and to refuse paying towards its support. It is self-evident that in so behaving he in no way trenches upon the liberty of others, for his position is a passive one. And whilst passive, he cannot become an aggressor. It is equally self-evident that he cannot be compelled to continue one of a political corporation without a breach of the moral law, seeing that citizenship involves payment of taxes, and the taking away of a man's property is against his will. It is an infringement of his rights." Man, this guy sounds like one of the founding fathers. But his work was dedicated toward psychology. And so he actually was able to make a very reasonable case, given that we all do have free will. And I find it fascinating that this work hasn't gained more substance and promotion. Now, what I do find is in the world of psychology, they look at social statics as a slice of social dynamics. And so what they focus on is the conditions that we live in a society that keep us from leaving the society, changing the society, rebelling to the society. They look at what it takes psychologically to keep a society in line. And I found this to actually be more or less a corruption of what he had written. It's interesting how many of the fields we study, particularly in the sociological or political fields, tend to be corrupted in some way or another away from their original intent. And it's very difficult for people who are, let's say, not versed in their freedom to understand where that corruption stems. So when we look at it from a psychological standpoint, yes, it has a very critical, clinical, and well laid out foundation. You must have certain things in a society that make it attractive so people will be members. You have to have conditions that are not too onerous or egregiously aggressive or violent, or people won't wish to be a member. And I look at what's happening in the Northwest and in Southern California now, and how there has been a great deal of violence. And it pretty much was, well, people are just expressing their distaste with things. But the problem is, in order to make it okay, they made the laws lax. And so it's no longer a preventive measure against the sort of bad behavior we get that most definitely infringes on the rights and properties of others. Psychology is not generally aimed at an outcome, but at analysis. And so when you look at a problem like this, you try to frame the circumstances that make that an issue, that make it emerge. You look at how people react. A lot of times we analyze a population and we get an observation of how the population reacts to changes in food, changes in environment. And if you look at things in the natural world, it's very easy to see how changes in environment, such as those which come with the changing seasons, will make a population of animals migrate to more clement circumstances. In the same manner, we have many drives and internal goals that are very similar with those of a population of animals. We are, after all, animals in all but our imagination. It is our abstract thinking that raises us above what we consider to be the lower animals. Many of them work in tandem with each other in ways we're not always aware, because we tend to turn a blind eye to a lot of the things that happen in nature around us. But when I'm looking at the works of psychologists, I see that they're trying to reduce it to predictable clinical levels, which is all well and good for a science or a discipline. But the issue is we're dealing with people who have literally God-given rights, the ability to choose and make their own decisions. So in the case of something in the wild, we know they're free to choose, and we don't hold them accountable for their actions. Instead, we work in a way that we eliminate species that are a threat to us, such as predators, or we control them in some way or another. We cannot do that with the human population because each of them is a full-blown conscious being. And many organizations, particularly political ones, will get around that by considering them less human than themselves, or marginalized, or subject to control. So in the real world, you would not need to control people in any way. You would set forth circumstances, you would set forth acceptable behavior, and you'd have a system that enforces a little bit of policing or control to keep things from going wild. And when people are taught good moral behavior and to understand why we do it, why we cooperate with others, this generally isn't an issue. I have a friend who grew up in Singapore, and he often tells a story about how everything is available in vending machines. And a fellow asked him, well, you mean beer is in vending machines? And he says, yes, mate, it is. And he says, well, what prevents kids from going and getting it? He says, because they're not allowed. And the fellow didn't quite get it. He says, yeah, but I mean, they could do it? And he says, so then why don't they do it? And he says, you don't understand, mate. They're not allowed. The issue is socially, they have learned the proper behavior and they don't want to violate that. You get a sense internally when you know you're doing something wrong. And we have to wake people up to that and get them to understand why. The issue is you don't want to swing too far and turn them into subservience. So this is very interesting. I'm going to read one more brief quote from his book. And again, his name is Herbert Spencer, and the book was published in 1851, Social Statics. And he says, an argument fatal to the communist theory, it is suggested by fact that a desire for property is one of the elements of our nature. And if a propensity to personal acquisition can really be a component of man's constitution, then that cannot be a right form of society which affords it no scope. In other words, if they say you can't own anything, that's an infringement of your actual nature. It is also true that no change in the state of society will alter its nature and its office. To whatever extent moderated, it must still be a desire for personal acquisition. Whence it follows that a system affording opportunity for its exercise must ever be retained, which means that the system of private property must be retained, and this presupposes a right of private property, for by right we mean that which harmonizes with the human constitution as divinely ordained. So in other words, we understand the need and the utility for having private property. We also know that the works we produce through our labor and our efforts are under our control. That is what ownership is. You have a thing, you own a thing, when it is in your control. And that form sometimes extends to a little more abstract form. I own this house, but I'm renting it to someone else. So I'm not relinquishing control, only a part of control in return for a benefit. So property, private property, is something that we feel the need to have. Notice in one of the talks that I gave that animals will often make a tool, and they'll use the tool for the accomplishment of a task. They will make a stone into a tool to crack a shell open and get the food inside, such as otters do. Birds will often trim a twig and stick it in the opening of a bark layer around a tree, and they'll fish out insects. And so we see that many animals do in fact make and use tools. But what they do not do, they do not have the abstract appreciation of what is to come, and they never bring a tool with them to a fight, so to speak. They always make it on the spot and discard it when they're done with it. One thing that our abstract thinking nature gives us is the ability to appreciate that the effort we put into crafting a tool turns it into an artifact that we may wish to retain. We control it, we use it for future purposes. So the Communist Manifesto is basically that you end up relinquishing all goods, all property. And we see a disturbing move in our future for governments and regulations to push us to own nothing and be happy. It truly isn't in our nature, and there's a reason for that. Ownership of private property is a very strong pro-survival trait. Your ability to build, acquire, trade, buy, whatever, the things you need to survive and to survive in comfort. And again, no matter what you choose to do, as long as you don't infringe on the rights and freedoms of another, you've done no wrong. You're free to do as you wish. That's the whole beauty of free will. The other thing is, when you have control of your environments, for a moment, for a space, you have a breathing spell. You have the ability to relax a little and think and focus and be the most human you can be. This is how the arts, music, and science all developed. When we had no agriculture and no property and no cities, and we lived in small clusters or tribes, we were often in a fight for our lives 24/7. It was only when we established safe communities, guards, agriculture, animal husbandry for eggs and milk and cheese, all of the things we needed to make a true civilization. It was at that time that we were free to put down the tools for a few minutes and just explore ourselves and the world around us and learn about it. And as it happens, that actually turned out to be our most powerful tool of all, the ability to learn about the world around us and gain some measure of control over it. So property ownership isn't something wrong, and they shouldn't be trying to take it away. You have the right to create anything you can imagine, or to buy anything you can imagine, and use it in any way you see fit, as long as you harm nobody. It's that simple. So I would have to say that out of the works that I've read, the term social statics, well, it was picked at random by the randomizer. And by looking into it, I found two distinct faces to this subject. One was the psychological one, and the other was the name of the book written by the man himself, Herbert Spencer. So take a moment, if you will, and read this book. Now, I have to admit, it's a little wordy, contingent on what you know of the English language. Today, people are not terribly literate, to be honest. And so it may be a hard read at first. But the elements you take away from it about our interaction with others in our society and our duty to be who we are and our freedom to do so are very important. And so, with that, I'm going to open the floor to comments, questions, or suggestions. Meanwhile, I'm going to remind you that we do appreciate all of our supporters and members, and to go to schultzlaboratories.com or universesciencecenter.com. Click on the links to sign up as a member and support our growth and expansion. And we'll share what we can with you: technical knowledge, science knowledge, mathematical knowledge, music, genetics, space travel, just about any subject you can imagine. We're adding more material now, and it becomes more dynamic and interesting by the day. And also join us for our classes and, of course, Randomizer, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on weekdays. And since I see a comment is coming in, yes, what is your question, please?
Yes, Charles, this is Elizabeth. I have a question, please. Given the image of a new world that we create, how does Mr. Spencer's approach or perspective affect society in the sense that we would have a new world?
Okay. Well, I would have to say that he makes a really good case against, for instance, communism, and for that matter, socialism. We often think of, for instance, socialism, many people think of it as a system that will support the underdog. The problem is, it's at the expense of people who are working all the time, and in today's world, you often can't even just barely make your bills. I think that the big issue here is if you remove your freedom to have property or to do as you wish, again, as long as you harm no one, if you remove those freedoms, it is in violation of what we know to be right, what is a part of our nature. And one of the things we do as human beings is we embrace our nature, we learn from it, and we try to refine it. We try to elevate ourselves from the conditions that our ancestors arose from. You know, it's our job to become, I would say, more angelic, more understanding, and more perceptive all the time. You don't become free by locking yourself in a room and retreating from reality. There's a real issue, sorry, an issue there. If we were to use these principles as Mr. Spencer has written, then we would find that the world would be a freer place. And it's only under the mantle of freedom that we truly create such beautiful things, such works of art, poetry, music, and science. Science is an art. I would say, from the scientists that I have known and the things that I've studied, the ones who are the freest thinkers and have the broadest interests are generally the most artistic and the ones who make the most interesting or astounding discoveries. So, in order to reach our full potential as humans, we must be free. And I strongly believe that. If we follow these principles, we'd have a freer world. Don't impress your will on someone else. They're free to act. There's only two ways that you can get something in this world out of somebody else. And one is by force, and the other is by coercion. And coercion can be as simple as, it would be helpful to us as a whole if you could lend a hand or help us with this problem. And, I think some people take coercion the wrong way, but it can be a peaceful and simple thing. And in the end, you always have the right to say yes or no. So, to me, the freest world is one in which we all can express exactly how we feel and who we are and do as we choose. And again, don't harm anybody else. I hope that was answering. And anyone else? Well, all right. I have a quote which amazingly, it was exactly in line. I'm going to read one little closing statement, and it is. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm, then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. And that's Galatians 5:1. And I am a Christian, and I let people know that. I don't make a big deal out of it, but I have people who come to me and say, as a scientist, how can you be a Christian? And it seems to be that those things would be in opposition to each other or at odds. And I guess the best way to put it is, if you think that that's true, then you either don't understand science or you don't understand Christianity. The whole thing is about fact, being truthful and being open and honest. So I'd say that pretty much summarizes it right there. Well, I hope that this has been an interesting chat. It might have it might have stirred a few people up, but I think that it's very worth saying that your freedom is valuable and don't let anybody take it. You are free to act as you will. Just don't harm anybody.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And make the world a better place for having lived in it. And thank you for listening. I'm Charles Schultz with Schultz Laboratories and Universe Science Center. Everybody have a wonderful evening, and we'll do this again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And good night.